VLANs are integrated into most everything a Layer 2 switch does. In this video, we'll look at the configuration and verification of the first wave of VLAN configuration. That is, how to configure a VLAN and how to configure an access port. Let's take a look. As always, I try to match the organization of the books. So there's a chapter in the books. Currently, it's chapter 8 in the first volume on VLANs and VLAN trunks. It's got 3 major sections. The second of those is about configuring and verifying VLANs and VLAN trunks. However, it's a pretty big section. So for the videos, I've broken it down into 4 separate videos, and I've numbered them 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D. This video is 2A about single switch VLAN config. And by that, I mean, if you've got one switch, we don't have to think about trunking because trunking only happens between a couple of switches. So it's just creating the VLAN and creating access ports, all right? So to get there, we've got 5 parts of this upcoming video. I'll do a few things to set up the video, and then we'll talk about what VLAN settings exist when you buy the switch, take it out of the cardboard box, and start using it, the defaults. Then we'll get into things like, hey, I'd like to use this other VLAN. What do I do? So how do you configure the VLAN? How do you configure access ports to be in that VLAN? And then we'll talk about some show commands, how to verify what you configured. As always, stay to the end and I'll give you some advice as if you're in my study group. In particular, I'll tell you what to use here at the Network Upskill channel to review and practice these things, as well as things you can find in the official Cert guide. All right, let's jump in and do it. First, I need to set the big picture on a few things for you. In the previous instructional video, I used this example, and we're going to configure that example in this video. So to review what we saw in that previous video for just a moment, we had an access layer switch, and we decided we're going to place these 6 ports in VLAN 11 as access ports. So we said, hey, let's put it in VLAN 11. That means all those ports need to have IP addresses in the same subnet. We didn't care what subnet it was, just that the idea was they're all in the same subnet. And we talked about how the command we'll use, that now in this video we'll talk in more detail, was switch port access VLAN 11, which basically tells the switch, hey, this port is in VLAN 11, all right? And we'll do the same thing over on those other 6 ports that we had decided we're going to put those in VLAN 12. You see the port IDs there. And because they're in a different VLAN, they're going to have IP address settings that put them in a second subnet that we show there as subnet B. And notice they're configured to be in a different VLAN. All right, so that's where we're headed here in this video. And we talked about how in order for the devices in those 2 different VLANs, 2 different subnets to communicate, there'd have to be some device like this router that would do IP routing to forward IP packets between those subnets. So it would be a routing pass to get traffic between those 2 rather than the layer 2 switch forwarding traffic between those 2 sets. All right, so a bit of review there. Now, if you don't remember that and you want to go back to that instructional video, you can look at the link that should be appearing over my head or in the description and go back and watch that first before you see this video that's going to be focused primarily on the config rather than the concepts, all right? Next up, we talked about these access switches like the one I just showed you in the context of the overall campus design. So typically you'd have maybe 2 distribution switches that only connect to other switches, mainly access switches, with a bunch of access switches like these. And those links between switches typically need to be trunks, as noted with these squares with a T on it. And what that means is those links can support traffic from multiple VLANs. So say if I had those access ports with some in VLAN 11 and some in VLAN 12, we could have frames from VLANs 11 and 12 over all these trunks, and it'd be one link supporting all the necessary VLANs for the design. In this video, we're not going into trunking. Next video up, we'll talk all about trunking, all right? Last context setting thing to talk about is that VTP is off. So for CCNA, Cisco does not include VTP anymore and hasn't for the last several iterations of the CCNA blueprint. So for the purposes of this video, which is for CCNA prep, we assume that VTP is off. And there are 2 VTP modes that can be configured that basically turn it off. That's the off mode, which pretty clearly should turn it off, and transparent mode, which is kind of the traditional way to turn it off. If either is configured, then things will behave as I described them here in this video. I will have another of the videos in this series that talk a bit about VTP to tell you some of the why and wherefore there, but just assume VTP is off. All right, that's the context. Now let's talk about the defaults. So you buy a Cisco switch, you unbox it, what's it configured like, right? So let's take a look at some show commands now. Why can't we look at show run? Because show run does not show us default settings, right? So we look at a show command like show VLAN brief. It lists all the VLANs that are pre-configured for us. So first off, there is a VLAN ID 1. So the VLAN IDs are numeric and they're decimal. All right, so VLAN ID 1 is pre-configured. It has a name. All the VLANs have a name. This one's default. Not only is 1, which is named default, pre-configured, you can't delete it and you can't rename it. There it is. All right. There are 4 other VLANs that just think of them as weird and unnecessary. They are there for historical reasons. They are pre-configured. You can't delete them and they are useless to you. Really. So just ignore them, 1002 through 1005. But let's talk about this VLAN ID 1. This command, show VLAN brief, interestingly enough, it has a ports column. And it lists the following. It lists all ports that are currently acting as access ports that are assigned to this VLAN, VLAN 1. Now, in this particular switch model, there are 24 gigabit ports and 4 10 gigabit ports. And if you look closely, you'll see there are 24 gig ports here and 4 10 gigabit ports here. So all the ports in this switch appear to be operating as access ports, and you guessed it, they are by default assigned to VLAN 1, and that's typical of the default config in a switch. All right. Now, the show VLAN command without the word brief at the end gives us more data, and it's more data that honestly is not very useful for the things we talk about in CCNA. So if you see where I'm waving the mouse pointer now, everything above that is what you got with show VLAN brief. Everything below it is the new information, and it doesn't talk about anything that we cover in CCNA. The only thing that might be useful in real life is this section about remote span, which is something you would do, for instance, to capture traffic so that you can use a traffic analyzer to see what's going on in your network. Useful in real life, just not covered in CCNA. So you're more likely to use show VLAN brief. But show VLAN ID with the VLAN ID number in it can be particularly useful, in particular when you've got lots of VLAN IDs, because it lists the same information as show VLAN, but it does so only for the listed VLAN ID. For instance, later when we configure 6 ports in VLAN 11, show VLAN ID 11 would give you a nice balance of information just about the ports in VLAN 11. All right. So the default state, you buy that Cisco switch, take it out of the box, or if you reset the configuration to all defaults, everything's in VLAN 1, all the ports. It's as if the configuration had a VLAN 1 command, which creates VLANs by their number. It's as if there's a name default command configured in VLAN config mode that names the VLAN, the word default. And then under each of the interfaces, there's a switch port access VLAN 1 command that says, hey, when you're an access port, you're in VLAN 1, and that'd be for all 24 gigabit ports and all 4 of those 10 gigabit ports. The first step is configuring the VLANs themselves. All right, so we need VLAN 11 and 12 per our design. So you get into global config mode and type VLAN 11 and press enter, and you've created VLAN 11, right? Pretty simple. If you want, you can use a non-default name or a default name for the VLAN. So to use a non-default name, you just type the name command while in VLAN config mode and give it the name you want, like my initials -11. Or if you want the default name, just use VLAN 12 and don't type anything else while in VLAN config mode, and it'll give you the default. What's the default name? Well, if you do a show running config now, you see the name command under VLAN 11 that you just typed, but under VLAN 12, there's nothing there. To see that default name, you do a show VLAN brief, whatever, and there's the default name that iOS creates. It begins with uppercase VLAN and then a 4-digit number, so it plugs in some leading zeros in front of the number if it's not a 4-digit VLAN ID. So that's 4 digits there. All right, so that's the VLAN ID or the VLAN name for VLAN 12, the VLAN name for VLAN 11, but most of the time you'll refer to them by their numbers anyway. Now notice we've got VLAN 11 and 12 created, but over here there's some blank space. So you don't always have your eyes drawn to blank space, right? But you've got all these interface IDs up here that we talked about before, right? So all the ports are still assigned by default to VLAN 1. So they're up here in the VLAN 1 section still. Because by default, even though we created these two VLANs just now, we've got the interface subcommand by default on every one of the ports that says switch port access VLAN 1, which means if you're acting as an access port, you're assigned to VLAN 1. So one of our next steps then is to override that default and assign these ports to VLANs 11 and 12 respectively. By the way, this video is sponsored by me and my books. If you don't happen to have them yet and you click that link or scan the QR code and go to my link tree and click the products link there and buy the books there, you don't have to spend any more money, but those sellers happen to give me a few dollars back from the sale. It's a great way to say thanks and support the channel, and I'd very much appreciate it. All right, back to the content. So you need two interface subcommands on a port to make it be an access port and be in a particular VLAN, and that's to configure those two things. These are the commands over on the right. So one command says be an access port, switch port mode access. The switch port mode command tells the port how we want it to behave, and then the switch port access means, hey, parameters when you're an access port, switch port access, and here's the VLAN number that we want that port to use. For instance, we've got port 1, gigabit Ethernet 101. We get into interface config mode for that port. Be an access port. And when you do that, be an access port in VLAN 11. There you go. Now that presumes that we've already configured the VLANs. So just a reminder, we created VLAN 11 and 12 before, so I'm assuming that. And now we've made that port an access port per that command in VLAN 11 per the second one. Now, we can be more efficient at how we go about configuring things because remember, we had 6 ports we wanted to be in VLAN 11 and 6 in VLAN 12. So we could keep repeating those commands over and over in interface mode for gig 102, then for gig 103, then for gig 104. But you may recall there's a command called interface range in config mode. So interface range, then gigabit Ethernet 101-6, which means to iOS, hey, all the commands I type now are interface subcommands for all 6 interfaces. So we type those same 2 commands. And iOS doesn't store the interface range command. Instead, we're telling it, hey, anything we type, expand it out and add it to all of these interfaces. So when we do a show run, we'll see these 2 commands under 6 interfaces, all right? 6 individual interfaces. Same thing with this next box where the interface range command refers to ports 7 through 12. It's the same 2 commands, but this time with VLAN 12, placing the ports on the right in VLAN 12. All right, so that's how to do the configuration. One last tangent here. Let's just say you got excited about configuring the access ports and giving them a VLAN ID, and you forgot to create the VLANs with the global commands. Well, iOS recognizes that and creates the VLAN commands for you. So say you typed in this order without ever having configured VLANs 11 and 12 yet. Interface, gigabit, whatever, switch port mode access VLAN 11, referring to a VLAN for which there's no global VLAN 11 command. iOS recognizes that and gives you this message, hey, the access VLAN does not exist. I'm creating it. And it creates the VLAN 11 global command for you, so you're already taken care of. So we've gone through all that effort to configure things. So what's the config look like? Well, here's a template for what you do to configure access ports to be in a particular VLAN. You need the VLAN to be configured, optionally give it a name, and then under each interface you tell it, be an access port with this command and use this VLAN ID with the second command. In this case, VLAN 11. Same thing on the other ports. You create the VLAN and then for each interface, be an access port and use this VLAN ID, in this case, VLAN 12. All right, so there's your configuration. With the show VLAN commands, let's talk about those again. Now that we've configured 6 ports into VLAN 11 and 6 access ports in VLAN 12, we're going to see different output now, right? Show VLAN brief. Now we see 6 ports over here on the right in VLAN 11. We see 6 ports in VLAN 12, just as expected. Ports 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 there off of VLAN 11, and 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 in VLAN 12, and the remainder still up here by default in VLAN 1. All right. Now, if you didn't want to see everything and you just care about one VLAN, like VLAN 11, show VLAN ID 11, briefer output. It shows us about VLAN ID 11. And by the way, I'm using 3 dots here to mean there's more output, but that's that output that is honestly not useful for us for the topics that we talk about for CCNA. Now, so far, I've only talked about show commands that are show VLAN something because we're configuring VLANs, right? But it turns out there are several show interfaces commands that tell us a lot about the interfaces and the VLANs they're using. And let's start now with show interfaces status, which is a very popular command, right? But we often look at the status column to see whether the port's connected or not connect and see if it's working, right? But there's also a VLAN column. And as you see here, there are numbers that look familiar from our example. So get this. If you've configured a port with that switch port access VLAN command, that VLAN shows up in this column. And we just configured the first 6 ports to be in VLAN 11 and the next 6 to be in VLAN 12. And there they are in show interfaces status. And you can confirm that there with this command. Then there's this other command that you probably haven't seen before now. It's show interfaces switch port. So if you do the command with the interface ID listed, you'll see this long set of messages about this interface only. If you leave off the interface ID, you'll get a long set of messages for every last interface. All right, so that can honestly be almost too much. So you might use the interface ID pretty regularly with this command. But I'm going to give you a different version of this output that only shows a few lines so I can make the font bigger so you can read it. So here's that same output, but just chopped off about 10 or 12 lines down. So show interfaces gig 101 switch port. That's one of those access ports that we assigned to VLAN 11. For instance, it says administrative mode. That's a reference to what you configured. And we configured switch port mode access. And that's why we see this phrase static access here. And it turns out there's some logic that says, hey, we know what you configured. Are we going to operate as an access port? And that means the operational mode. What are you actually working as right now? It shows up as static access. Down here it says, what access mode VLAN are you using? Assuming you are operating as an access port, and we're using, you guessed it, VLAN 11 on this port. The VLAN whose name is WO-11. All right, so you can see there's a lot of rich information in this command. You'll use this command a lot out in production. So what do you do with this topic from here? Well, first off, single switch VLAN is just configuring the VLAN and creating access ports. You can practice this on all your favorite platforms, Packet Tracer, CML, and Real Gear. I would suggest that it's worth looking at the additional examples in the book, but this is one of 4 videos that matches that middle section of the matching chapter. So I'd say, finish the other videos about that section first. The next one's on trunking. The next one's on trunks to IP phones. Get through all that and then go back and review and see the extra examples in the books. As for practicing this, I've got a config lab for you. So the config labs are on my blog site. There's a web page that details the lab. It's linked in the show notes, the description to this video. I've also got intro and review videos for that lab as well. For this lab, you've got a switch, 2 VLANs, 2 PCs in each VLAN, and just like we did in the video here, you configure the VLANs, you configure the static access ports, and assign them to those VLANs. All right, it's always good to use multiple sources for your CCNA study or for any exam for that matter. So use the book, look at the examples in particular. In this case, it's just more examples that can help and different analogies as well. So check that out in the appropriate time. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you're ready for more instruction, then click on the video you see on the left, which gets you to the next video in sequence, which is about VLAN trunking. If you want to do that lab that I just mentioned, well, click on the right, and that'll get you to the Config Lab intro video, and you can get into that. Hey, thanks for hanging out. I'll talk to you soon.